So joining me this time on CodeTalk, we have, and I'm going to embarrass him by saying we have somebody who reminds me of Marvin, but not in the sort of paranoid android style, but brain the size of a planet, and it's somebody who I learn so much from all the time. But the thing is, he's so helpful as well. Ladies and gentlemen, it is Dr. David Kunz. I got the doctor in because that's super important, even though David doesn't call himself doctor. He says, shaking your head already. So David, welcome.
Hi, DJ. Thanks for having me. And I learned a lot from you, of course, too.
Get lost. Anyway, Anyway, let's get on with this. So we've got a subject that's really close to my heart, and of course David's heart. So it's all about CAP. And let me just sort of, tempt people by saying it's about developing CAP in alternative environments, let's say, that are more true to, hardcore, proper Unix style development contexts. So it's all about CAP and Neovim effectively. Now, as people may know, and I think you are going to talk about this a little bit more later on, Neovim is like a new version of Vim. So talking of Vim, my favorite editor, why would you use such an old editor?
Yeah, that's a good question. I remember the first contact I had with Vim back in university when my colleague was editing text, and I glimpsed over his shoulders and he showed me how he does it. And I was a bit confused because it didn't have any GUI. It was just basically text. And I asked him what it was, and he said, yeah, it's Vim. And then he showed me how it works. He showed me that if you press DD, it would delete a line. And if you press 3DD, then it would delete 3 lines. And I still remember that I found it super cumbersome to do. And I couldn't imagine how this could actually be efficient, right? So I asked him, is this efficient? And he was like, that's the best editor out there. So I was curious because this guy really knew a lot. And then I tried it out myself and I booted it up. And of course, in the beginning, it was super frustrating because everything you know from typical software would not be applicable to Vim. Everything is different. You have no UI, you have no context menu. I mean, nowadays, I think there is one, but back then you didn't have one. And everything you do, you had to memorize. So I tried it out and I forced myself on this Vim to do everything the Vim way, meaning hands off the mouse, hands off the arrow keys, and learn the commands and be as efficient as possible.
That's amazing. I mean, also, and we're already going off script, but I don't care because it's David and me. One thing it might be worth for you to explain to the CodeTalk listeners is when you said, you hit DD and it deletes a line. Maybe you could explain a little bit about the fact that Vim is a modal editor.
Sure thing. So in normal editors, if you press DD, it would type the letters DD as one would usually expect. But in Vim, everything is a bit different. Everything is controlled by the keyboard. And as opposed to Emacs, where you constantly have to hold another key to not type the stuff in, which would cramp your fingers exactly. In Vim, it's solved in a, I would say, better way because there you have different modes. And there's this thing called normal mode. And in normal mode, when you press DD, it doesn't insert DD, but it actually deletes the line. Or if you press DW, it deletes the next word and things like that. And to actually type the text, because that's what text editors are usually for, to type text, you have to go into the so-called insert mode. And then when you type D, you will type the letter D, actually. So that's how Vim works. It's a modal editor.
Perfect. Thank you, David. Thank you. So actually, just getting back to your initial foray into the wonderful world of VI and Vim, just tell us a bit about what your experience was like.
At the beginning, horrible, I must say, because the learning curve is quite steep. So at the beginning, I think you start with a negative because all the things which you know from normal editors, they don't apply. So you start it up, and if you can even type something, then you're already off to a great start. But usually you can't, and you also don't know how to quit. You don't know anything, right? So you start as a negative, as somebody who had never used a text editor before. You're on that level. But then you go through the tutorial, and there's a nice built-in tutorial, and so you learn the most basic commands, and some of the things are a bit weird. For example, there's this famous HJKL concept of navigating. So you don't use the arrow keys, you use HJKL to navigate left, down, up, and right. And that also was a bit weird getting used to. But at some point it becomes second nature, and then you miss it everywhere you are.
Yeah.
And I think that is generally true. So the moment you go through this whole tutorial, and the moment you get the stuff in your fingers, which is important, it's not enough for it to be in your brain. It has to be in your fingers to be able to effectively use it, up to a point where you don't even think about it. Then it becomes second nature, and then you start missing it everywhere. The moment you're used to the Vim key bindings, you want to have them everywhere, in your operating system, in your web browser, and of course also in your IDEs.
In your IDE, we're going to come back to IDE in a second, but David and I know this, but put in the comments, if you're watching this on YouTube, on our SAP Developers channel, for example, put in the comments where you think this HJKL came from. It's a specific terminal that the creator of VI, Bill Joy, used. So put in the comments if you know what that terminal model was. It's wonderful. Also has the reason why we use a tilde for home. Anyway, I'm going to go back to the fact that you said an IDE. I thought you used Vim. What do you mean by an IDE?
Yeah, that's true. So I use Neovim for my current development. So only in Neovim, nothing else. But when I started at SAP, I started as an ABAP developer, and there were only two IDEs available. One was SE80, the other one was Eclipse. So I went with Eclipse, and of course, the first thing I did was install the Vim extension, so I at least get my key bindings. It was a good experience. It was okay, but it wasn't vanilla Vim, right? So I like this minimal approach. I don't like when the UI is cluttered. I don't like too many toolbars. I don't like when the startup speed is too slow. So it was not the greatest experience in the world compared to vanilla Vim, in my opinion, because I'm just a minimalistic guy and I want to have my tools tailored to my needs, as minimalistic as possible.
Yeah.
So I also created in my private YouTube channel, Dev on Duty, I also created a video why I prefer Neovim over VS Code, for example. And many people commented. It was a very lively discussion because so many people are so passionate about their text editors as I am passionate about my text editor. And yeah, it was a great discussion. And it's these small things which, yeah, slightly annoy me, that in Vim, everything is keyboard controlled, so you never have to reach for the mouse. In other IDEs, there are great keyboard shortcuts, I'm not going to lie, but for some things you have to use the mouse, especially if you use some plugins which are just made for the mouse. And so you're constantly switching, and I don't like this. I prefer keyboard-only mode.
Me too. And in fact, I think some people would go so far and have gone so far to describe the way you approach manipulating and editing text as with the language. You have modifiers, you have actions, and so on. So it's almost like you're learning a language. I think you agree there, right? But in terms of editing text, it's not just about editing text. If you're a developer, you need to edit text, but you also need features like code completion, right? So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's true. And that's actually one of the questions most people ask me when they see that I use Neovim. They ask, yeah, but what about those high-level features which I have in my insert favorite IDE, like VS Code, code completions, debugging, all this kind of stuff. And that's interesting because when VS Code was released, they introduced a concept called language server protocol. And this is a really great technology coming from VS Code because it for the first time, well, I think it was the first time, it standardized language support across editors. That means you have this language server running in the background, and this language server knows about that particular language, let's say Node.js, JavaScript, and it knows about the code base, it knows where definitions are, things like that, and can support functions like rename this variable or something. And now they communicate with the text editor using the language server protocol. And that means you have essentially decoupled this, the implementation effort to support various programming languages from the editors. So now it's not that one editor has to support many programming languages, but the editor only has to support the language server protocol. And once it supports that, it supports all the languages which have such language servers. And that's also one of the reasons why there are now so many new text editors, Neovim only being one of them, of course, but also others like SAP or Helix. They all use the language server in the background for language features. And the other great feature also coming from VS Code is the debug adapter protocol. So debugging obviously is also very important to me, especially when you're working with a large JavaScript code base. Then you don't have all the types in your head unless they are annotated, but usually that's not the case in my case. So I have to debug, and I don't want to do console log debugging. Sometimes I like it, but usually it's not very efficient. So I want to stop the program, halt the program, inspect variables, debug into functions, set conditional breakpoints, and all of that. Now, how does it work in Neovim, or why does it work at all? So VS Code has an excellent debugger. And also here, there's a nice concept called the debug adapter protocol, which is very similar to the language server protocol. It creates this kind of decoupling. And now all editors which support the debug adapter protocol have the possibility to debug applications. And that's exactly what happens in Neovim too. You still need an extension to do that, to have this debug support, but it works. And now the last feature, which is important when editing code, usually you have syntax highlighting. You don't work on white text on a black background usually. You want to have colorful colors. And there's one feature which didn't come from VS Code this time, but actually from the Atom text editor, which is tree sitter. So tree sitter is a parser generator, and it can generate abstract syntax trees based on source code. So you give it a piece of source code, let's say JavaScript, and it creates this abstract syntax tree, or AST in short. And in this abstract syntax tree, you can really see the different nodes, the node types, where they are in your source code, the location. And you can see that, for example, in line 20, there's a constant defined. So once you have this abstract syntax tree, syntax highlighting becomes trivial, because then you just have to loop over those nodes, find the location in your source code, and based on the node type, put different colors on these things. So extremely trivial. And with tree sitter, it's also possible that you edit the source code, and then generating the new abstract syntax tree based on these changes is incredibly fast. So many modern text editors actually use tree sitter to do syntax highlighting. Neovim being one of them, or the newer version of Emacs, or also Helix and SAP. SAP, by the way, are the same people who build the Atom text editor. So of course they would use tree sitter.
Nice. I mean, I think, didn't you you gave a talk at the Neovim conference last year, and I think you talked about building a plugin with tree sitter, right? I watched that, and I also, it's like by association, I feel really cool because you spoke to TJ and the Primegen at the same time. It's like, and I know David, and therefore I'm famous. No, but I mean, that was a great talk, wasn't it?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I gave a talk about how to build plugins with Lua. So in Vim back then, when you wanted to create plugins, usually you would do it in Vim script. I tried to learn it. I gave up. It's no joy. I really didn't like it. It works. You can learn it. It's fine, but it's so different to what you're usually used to, and I didn't like it. So when Neovim was built, they introduced Lua as an extension language. If you know JavaScript, you basically know Lua. It's, I would say, the same thing. Slightly different syntax, slightly different APIs, pretty much the same thing otherwise. So at least for the basics. And so it's extremely easy to build a plugin. You can build a plugin in a few lines of Lua. It's super simple. And the great things about thing about creating extensions with Neovim is, since tree sitter is built in, you can rely that it's installed. It's not always enabled for everybody, but kind of is nowadays. I think most people use it. So you can rely that it's installed, and then you can make use of the abstract syntax tree and create plugins based on that AST information, which makes some things really simple. So instead of working with the source code directly, which you have to kind of make sense of using sophisticated regular expressions or things like that, you can just say, okay, if this node type is that and that, then do this, which is perfect. Same goes for the LSP. You can control the LSP behavior with plugins and other things. So it really makes plugin development very easy.
Cool. So let's move on away from sort of mainstream languages like, the two languages of CAP, which are JavaScript and Java, and maybe talk a little bit about potential support for CDS itself.
Yeah, that was a bit tricky because Neovim obviously supports many different programming languages, JavaScript being obviously in the supported languages. But for CDS, it's a different picture because it's a proprietary language from SAP, and there was no built-in support for CDS. But at SAP, there are two great tools which were created. One of them is the CDS language server by the fabulous CDS tools team. So they created a language server, which means, as we learned before, that it can be used across editors, also in my beloved Neovim. So now I can use Neovim for CDS files, and I get all the functionality like go to definition, rename this entity, and things like that, which is perfect. And the other great invention from the CAP team is a tree sitter parser. So Andre Meyering from SAP, from the CAP team, he created the tree sitter parser for CDS files. And with that, I also get syntax highlighting for free. By the way, in my first attempt to use Neovim for CDS, that was not yet available back then. And you created a regex-based approach for syntax highlighting. And I took it over into my setup, and I used it, and it worked also very well. But now we have tree sitter, standardizing it a bit more with the rest. And it's great, yeah.
Perfect. So talking about JavaScript and the debug adapter protocol and everything, tell me a little bit about testing and debugging and maybe what we have in store for the community as well.
Yeah, so debugging is a bit tricky because debugging is a complicated thing usually, and in Node.js you typically use some framework for debugging, for example Jest. So in VS Code I was always used to navigate to a particular test I wanted to run or debug, and then I hit the button or clicked on something, and then the test ran, or I could debug the test. This unfortunately was not possible in Neovim, and there was, unfortunately at that time at least, no plugin which would enable me to do that as comfortably as in VS Code. So I created one plugin myself, which is called Chester. Open source, can be found on my GitHub page. And this allows you exactly to do that. You navigate your cursor to the test, you hit a command, and then the test runs. If you want to debug it, you hit another command, and you can debug the test. Works really well for me, and much better than in VS Code, because again, I don't have to use my mouse. And whenever I think, oh, that would be handy to have this feature, then I just build it, and it's done, and it can really improve your workflows. And I think that's usually what Neovim users do, or Vim users do, is they work, and if they find that there's something which is inefficient or which bugs them or annoys them, they try to fix it using the comment functionality. If this doesn't exist, then they use a plugin, maybe. If this doesn't exist, they still can just write their own plugin, or at least write their own functionality. It doesn't necessarily need to be a plugin, but it's very extensible, and you can really adapt it to your needs. And I think TJ coined the term PDE, personal development environment, and I think it really fits. So we are usually the tinkerers, the people who adapt the software to our needs to make us as efficient as possible. Perfect.
David, we could talk for hours. Both you and I are good talkers, but also the topic itself is fantastic. And I thank you for flying the flag for, real editors, for real developers in the CAP world. We're almost at the end, but I was wondering if you had any final thoughts to our listeners.
No, but maybe if you want to learn more about Neovim, or if you think you want to use Neovim and want to see how I set it up, you can of course go to my GitHub page. There you can see my Vim config, everything in Lua. So it's easy to understand. I hope it's a bit cluttered at the moment, but you'll find your things. I also wrote a blog post back then to use Neovim for CAP development. I'm sure we can maybe link it. Yep. So that should help you get started. And otherwise, I would just say go for it if you have an interest in it. For me, it was really fun experience to go and go that route of Vim. And I created also my private YouTube channel where I mostly talk about Neovim. So I'm really passionate about it, and I really like it. And I hope others will also feel some joy using it.
Fantastic. So, by the way, the YouTube channel is Dev on Duty. We'll link to that also in the show notes. But it just goes for me to thank you, Dr. David Kunz, for spending some time with me talking about one of our favorite topics. So thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you, DJ, for having me.
Okay. Bye, folks.
Bye.